So I'm so grateful that we get to have this time together to connect over one of our favorite persons, Tammy Faye, who in this podcast we're calling Saint Tammy. And I know when we first were collaborating on the idea, one of the thoughts we had is that we would throw out a topic or a theme that we would just almost free associate and riff on. And I think the one today for this first episode is eyes. And so I just kind of want to throw it out there and see what you guys come up with when you think about Tammy Faye and the centrality of eyes.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that in terms of Tammy's revival, first of all, in the sort of early 90s as a cult figure through the World of Wonder documentary, The Eyes of Tammy Faye, and then sort of this maybe second coming more recently, connected with the Jessica Chastain movie, also called The Eyes of Tammy Faye, which is based on the original documentary, that eyes play such a key role. So just in terms of that kind of like unconscious imagery that's tied to Tammy, eyes are really important. I think on the most sort of basic level, it's to do with the makeup, the signature eyelashes. But I think it's just interesting that when, without even thinking about it, like automatically what comes up for people when they think about Tammy is this notion of eyes. And I'm sure it is much more than just the makeup.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, for me as well. When I remember talking to Jessica Chastain when she was working on the film, and I said, have you ever noticed? And I mean, of course, I noticed this growing up because she's my mother. That my mom carried a lot of sadness in her eyes at times, even when she was really moving forward. And and I think when they say the eyes of Tammy Faye, like Helen said, people, the eyelashes and the eye makeup and things like that. But for me, there was something very human about her eyes, and the struggle was alive in her eyes, and the courage, because when you see someone fighting and fighting to live, really, and you see that sadness in their eyes, you see the battle, you see that this is they're really doing something important and to them in their spirit. And I find that was with my mom, a lot. Like she could, when she would stress or when she would be nervous, I would just look at her eyes. And it's interesting because my daughter has my mom's eyes. My daughter, who's like 5 years old, has blue eyes, and both me and Minnie's and Minnie's mom are both brown eyed. So their blue eyes jumped over to Minnie. And it's interesting to be able to see those eyes in my mother, and kind of like that life of those blue eyes that just express so much, and to see that, see moments of happiness again in those similar eyes. So I think it's really interesting also the fact of how a lot of these things you're seeing her through other people's eyes too. So in some ways it's like a projection. The eyes of Tammy Faye. Well, it's not really the eyes of Tammy Faye. It's your eyes through your eyes to Tammy Faye.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
It's interesting, this idea of interpretation of Tammy, because we were just saying before we pressed record, one of the most amazing things about Tammy was how so many people are drawn to her for so many different reasons. There's something about her that's really compelling to everybody, potentially. I mean, who can say everybody, but all kinds of different communities, right. Conservatives, liberals, activists of different kinds, people who are, more conventionally religious. And there is something in Tammy that maybe resists interpretation, that's elusive, but that makes her interesting to so many different people. There's something universal in her, but maybe the universal thing is just there's something that's kind of undefinable, and her undefinability lends her to sort of being seen from all these different angles. And maybe this is why she's so compelling, and why she has stood the test of time, having passed away nearly 2 decades ago.
Yeah.
I mean,
still thinking about it.
And the fact is, like, she had so many critics, and not even proper critics, but like comedians, and she was the butts of jokes in the 80s. and people who said really horrible things. And there's still people who say not nice things. I mean, a few months ago, I had someone who was like a Princeton theologian person come like talk horrible about my mom and put up this horrible article about my mom. And I
Really?
tried to defend her. And it was really tough because they were really cruel, because they wanted to think, well, no, she had some sort of secret bad motives. Like everybody's trying to. So my mom had to survive a lot of critique like that. A lot of people saying you're not who you really are. Your tears are fake and things like that. But
Wow.
I can tell you those tears were very genuine. They might have been, prompted by too much Valium or Ativan that she took for panic attacks. But at the same time, they were very genuine, and she felt very deeply. And I know that because I feel very deeply. So, here you have I almost wish in some ways it's like the second coming of Tammy Faye. I wish she could see it, just so she could see that people really did love her and celebrate her, because in her mind, she just never gave up. She never stopped moving forward. She's never let the bastards get her down. She never let the critics get her down. She had moments of sadness and things like that, but she never changed. And I think if I was watching comedians make fun of me and let's say like, oh, Jay's hats and blah, 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 and we know he's covering up his bald spot, you know what I mean? Like that, after a while, you'd be like, I'm not wearing a hat anymore. I'm getting a hair trim, just do something.
Yes.
And my mom just stayed true to who she was. And there was something that really, and I think that's why in my own life, I kind of got guided towards punk rock, because of that idea of being who you are and being unapologetic about who you are. That she also had. So she really is a fascinating character. I mean, for me, it's strange. It's just that she was also my mother.
One of the things that struck me in going back and reading her book, I Gotta Be Me, is, and I know you've said this about yourself, Jay, that you can be a sensitive person, and I'm the same way. She strikes me as, even in her earliest days, being not only very sensitive, but also very self-aware. And I wonder how that speaks to you. She just strikes me as someone who was a deep thinker, reflecting on herself, and experiencing a lot of different kinds of emotions.
Well, I think that book, I Gotta Be Me, actually kind of allow me to see how much closer I am to her and how self-aware we both really were. I always thought I got that from my father, but she really was self-aware, and she was really and aware of those around her.
Yes.
And always looking to see how other feels. And she had a lot of empathy, and I always thought maybe her strength is that she wasn't as self-aware as I thought, as not as self-aware as, but, realizing she really was. She really, really was. And that's fascinating.
But it's interesting, in terms of people trying to make a joke out of, well, first of all, we've heard a little bit on this journey of making work about Tammy, that some people have said things like, oh, why are you so interested in this woman? She was just a joke. But people don't really understand the philosophical importance of a joke.
That's a good point.
Jokes, Freud says that the joke is the royal road to the unconscious, and the unconscious is speaking subjects as humans who have the capacity to think and to speak and to feel and to be self-reflexive. We all have an unconscious, and the thing that really gets there for everybody is humor. And not only that, but humor is the greatest sort of medicine. If you want to communicate something, the best way to do it is to make people laugh. So in a way, this criticism of being just a joke, I mean, that's actually a really important thing in society, and a really huge power that someone has if you are a sort of a humorous person, or somebody who is able to make a joke about oneself, and also to really recognize the humanity in oneself. But it's interesting, I always think about Tammy's interview with Ruby Wax, which I just thought was quite amazing, because Ruby Wax uses that kind of humor where in the sort of Ali G, Borat type humor, where you're playing a sort of naive character and naive interviewee to make the other person seem ridiculous, to show up the sort of contradictions and ridiculousness in the other person. But Ruby Wax, in a way, in the interview with your mother, is the one that ends up looking silly, because your mom just she's so, it's almost like the joke, was the art of war, right? I don't know, she lets the I don't know, I've never read that, but people, I think there's something from that where, like, you know, you just let the other person sort of fall, you know, into, you know, sort of stuff. And she just, you know, she's sort of this transparent kind of, there's no resistance in her. So the joke just sort of bounces back onto Ruby Wax. It's like she's in on the joke as well. So, you know, the joke trying to make her look silly just doesn't land.
Yeah, mom was. That's a great thing. She was always in a joke, and it would be funny because I've seen her do things where she was on interviews with like theologians and things like this, where they would also try to make fun of her, belittle it, and she just always just stuck to who she was. And it's like, well, okay, honey, that's okay, honey. You know what I mean? And it was just that type of thing where it all just kind of bounced back on the person who was trying to make her look foolish, because she was always like, well, I'm not trying to be anything I'm not. I'm not trying to be something I'm not. I know who I am. I know my limitations. And I know my faith might seem naive to you, but it's not naive to me. It's my faith, and it's very deep. And I think the proof of how deep that faith was, and how more evident it is than most people's faith, to be honest with you, even highly intellectual philosophers and theologians, is that she has a film made about her, plays are being made of her. We're doing we're doing the documentary, we're doing a talk, we're doing a podcast about her.
Right.
It's this. There was, no matter how naive we think it may have been, it was extremely genuine, and it worked. And that to me is the proof. There is it worked. It worked to make everybody feel loved. And I always think about this verse in the Bible where Jesus tells his disciples, like, you'll know that you're mine. People will know you're mine, that you're my followers if you love each other. And they'll know you by your love for one another. And to see my mom being celebrated for her love for everybody is kind of like, well, there it is. Like, we can talk theology all day. We can talk philosophy all day. We can talk, what's the word I'm looking for? Scholarship all day. But at the end of that, what she did worked. I mean, the like, when I think about like conservative Calvinism and stuff, and like how that, the logical outcome of that is never good. Like, it never ends well. Like, I meet a lot of people who went through it here with the Mark Driscolls and stuff. And it never ended well, and everybody's hurt. But the logical outcome of, God loves you, honey. God makes no junk. You're accepted. You're loved. It just seemed to work for her. And the fact of always being in on the joke, like, people would make fun of her eyelashes in front of her, and she would just laugh it off. She would watch Saturday Night Live and laugh it off. Like, when I was a kid and angry, I couldn't understand how she did it, but it was like a superpower, really. It's almost as like she was Irish, because when you go to Ireland, everybody's in on the joke. You're always going to be part of the joke, and everybody's, and she was in on it, and everybody else just, it was very disarming for people here. I think she would have done probably better in somewhere like Ireland. I remember seeing people like really try to take it out of with these jokes and say something really sly. And she just was really, she knew what time it was. I mean, she knew what was going on. She knew that was there. Yeah. And she kind of made, it is funny. It was kind of like she kind of exposed the person for being either petty or being manipulative, or, you know what I mean? All of a sudden, whatever they were doing that they thought they were so clever about, just kind of like, just shined through very clearly,
Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I was going to say that, just following on from that, in terms of her honesty. So, that kind of humor where you're trying to do it at the expense of the other person. So this sort of faux naive interviewer trying to sort of bring something out of the, cringy or repressed interviewee. The thing is your mum wasn't hiding anything, and this is there was nothing to bring to the surface. It was all on the surface, and as you say, with her eyes, they really communicated the emotion that she so readily felt. But in terms of her eyes and her eye makeup, there is this idea that people think that masks, people have a really facile understanding sometimes of what repression is or what hiding something is, because sometimes the greatest truth is portrayed in a mask. And so because the mask or the makeup, like your mum's makeup, it might have been, anxiety assuaging for her in some way, but also it allowed her to interact with the world with greater authenticity, precisely because it was protecting her in some way. So it is interesting that this kind of humor that's trying to be at the expense of someone, when they're not trying to hide anything, it doesn't work. But I guess there's maybe, there's at least two types of humor, but maybe we can say that the antithesis to that kind of humor, which is trying to take the piss out of somebody, is the humor precisely where you are in on the joke. And often when, when you're really good friends with somebody, when you feel comfortable making a joke about them, but in the sort of this category of mutual,
right,
reciprocity of humor and not hiding anything from the other person. One of my best friends is from a different culture, and the other day, and we have very good, friendly, funny relationship, and we've worked together for a long time. And my nephew's school in another country, which is, let's say, less PC, they all dressed up. They were doing different cultures, and they dressed up, so that my nephew's 4, they dressed up for the day in outfits and costumes from the country that my other friend is from. And, in terms of the sort of PC, very teeth sucky, you can't say that, kind of defensive non-humor, I do think we need to bring humor and lightness back to society. This is the most offensive thing. But I knew, because, my friend and I are so close, and we have that kind of relationship, he found it absolutely hilarious. And one of my favorite things, for instance, is Americans taking the piss out of my accent. I think it's like the best thing. It's the most satisfying thing. I love it. But there's that kind of humor which is more reciprocal and more indicates a kind of fraternal relationship with one another. And in our very divided society, that's kind of gone.
Yeah. Okay. So Helen, in light of that comment, one of the things I wanted to explore was when you guys talk about, there's kind of a second coming of Tammy Faye. She has kind of this renewed interest. Do y'all have a sense why that is? What does that renewed interest say about where we're at as a society, as a culture, as a world? Why is she so popular again these days?
I think Helen's going to have a better, deeper response for this, but I'm going to give you a quick response so we can hear what Helen has to say in her proper accent.
Yeah, because this is all about hearing what Helen has to say. Let's be honest.
Yeah, it really is. We're just like the conduit. We're the straw.
Yeah.
Straw into the tea.
Exactly.
But for me, I think what happens is that we're in a culture that everything is taboo. On both sides, like you right and left, everybody's offended. Everybody's offended by something. Everything's offensive by something.
Right.
And here you have a woman who just embodied all of that. Like, she was the complete contradiction of both of those worlds coming together, and their contradiction. And she walked in between those two lines. And she just was like, oh, I love you. I love you. I love you. And, oh, honey, isn't that special? Oh, silly, isn't that fun? And just would bring people together and laugh and stuff. And she didn't really, like, I would see her disarm like the most conservative, like, old men, but also like the most like annoying, like, liberal, intellectual comedians, who are like, oh, I'm going to make you look like a fool, and she would just disarm them, so like there was never any area for people to really be divided with her. That was just kind of like, you're with her. And it kind of, I think what people are longing for, even if it's unconscious, is a time, and maybe even the 80s and 90s, is a time when we were less divided. That would be, something I think, but I'll let Helen take it from there.
No, I mean, I entirely agree with you. And I think there is something unconscious. I think that people do know that this is an extremely divisive time, and that the kind of enemy making that sustains this sort of, when things get really bad in a society, often humans revert to sort of utopian thinking in order to not confront the reality of the work that's needed to be done to make the world a better place for everybody. And the utopian thinking, precisely because in this world, the sort of the grit and grime of planet Earth, there isn't really anything perfect, but the imperfection is precisely what allows something to exist at all. But when we think about things in utopian terms, because that utopian reality is impossible, what then starts to happen and the utopian pull becomes stronger and stronger the more difficult the world is, because it's much more soothing to think we can have, you know, this perfect world, is you start to create scapegoats or enemies behind whom that perfect world would exist, if only. So it might be, we would have a perfect society if only, for instance, in the UK where I'm from, people hadn't voted for Brexit, or we would have a perfect world if only this group wasn't banging on about issues related to gender or something like that.
Sure.
And it becomes more and more and more intense the more and more difficult society becomes. And it's understandable, because it's really, really hard to live as a human being in the 21st century. We live in a very divisive time. We've had, you know, drops in living standards. There are all sorts of anxiety producing things going on. It's not easy at all. But I think we know at a certain level that deep down we have to find a way to navigate this reality with all different types of groups of people, with all different types of desires. And that's what politics really is. Politics really is not, you know, when people say, oh, I don't like politics, I think often what it means is just, I don't like party politics. What sort of politics has devolved into, which is,
Right.
I think, precisely not really politics, which is sort of preventing politics from happening, because it's very much like, I'm in the right, you're in the wrong. And that's, you know, and nothing actually gets done. And it's actually preventing politics from happening, which is sitting down with people you don't agree with and coming up with solutions or working things out. And I think deep down we know that in order to create a more livable world for everybody, we need to recognize the humanity in different groups. And I think Tammy did that. And it's interesting, I think Dolly Parton is still so loved by different groups of people, and she's one of these people that seems to cross the divides. But the other thing that I think is really interesting about Tammy, and I think it's why the gay community, potentially one of the reasons why the gay community in the 80s really, you know, well, the 80s, she reached out to them in the 80s during the AIDS epidemic, when she was you know, a major televangelist, and then they later supported her in her later life. But I think gay people really identified with her because they'd been through so much at a given time. And Tammy, she's like this Duracell bunny who keeps going, and you can see how much she suffered. You really can see how much she suffered. She's almost like this Christ-like figure, this crucified figure who you can just feel what she's been through. And I think today, people, makes me very emotional, but nobody gets to a certain point in their life unscathed. Like, life is really, really hard.
Yes.
And I think life is really hard, especially now, for so many different people, because of the divisiveness of society, because of the way the economy's gone. You know, people's hopes and dreams have been crushed. And often, you know, certain groups are blamed for it. So if you're from a certain group where, you know, you've really suffered, and because of the oppositional logic of so-called politics these days, you might be the reason, you might be, you know, at certain times people blame it on one group or another group. And in different situations, people get blamed, and it's really hard. And when people really are victims in society, nobody knows that you're a victim because you don't have a voice. And I think a lot of people feel very, very victimized. I mean, the word victim is used a lot, but it's almost used in a way to not recognize who the real victims are, but to allow an unfair system to sustain itself by saying, well, let's continue this exploitation because at least we're recognizing, you know, some sort of victimhood of certain people. But it really is something about, you know, what everyone's going through, even though we have to recognize that at different times in history and in different moments in time, and even today, certain groups for contingent reasons are experiencing, you know, more difficulties than others. But that's not to say that, you know, life as such isn't difficult, and we have to acknowledge that. You know, it's really hard often for humans to think dialectically, and I think Tammy was really able to do this, and this is a very Christian mode of thought from a sort of Paulinian perspective, is that two things can be true at once. You know, somebody can be suffering, but everyone can be suffering as well as this particular group who might be suffering especially. But we can't do away with understanding that there are universal problems as well as individual problems, and individual problems as well as universal problems. And I think Tammy was able to think with that kind of logic. But I think people are really, there's a lot of people finding life really difficult now. And Tammy is someone that they can identify with in her very overt expression of living through hardship.
Mm. Oh, that's powerful. So Jay, I know if you don't mind reflecting on this, you know, even in your recent sermon series on Galatians, you've been talking about, you know, not polarizing and the proclivity to scapegoat and create enemies. I'm just curious how your mom and just her legacy has kind of shaped some of that thinking for you.
I mean, she was really, I don't know if the right word is enigma, or she just was really, she was really just like this, you know, ball of empathy in some ways. Like she could really, she didn't, it's for someone who was so scapegoated and part of such a scapegoating thing. I mean, the fact that she was married to my father, you know, my father was probably the main focus of the scapegoating. But then my mom's personality and being so wild, and her makeup and everything made her more of the object of the butt of the easy joke, you know, the ridicule. And but you know, for me, she knew pain was pain, and so she could see the pain on people who are either on either side.
Sure.
You know, she could see the woman, you know, the Christian woman who's been raised their whole life conservative and is worried about their son or daughter being gay, and she could sit down and listen to them, but also encourage them to love their children. But she could also sit down with the child, you know, the kid as well, and empathize and say, well, the church hates me. And she goes, well, I know what that feels like. I've had, you know, they've made fun of me. They'll feel like the world hates me. And she knew what that felt like. And so it was like, we have like this way of being very particular about who gets sympathy and who doesn't nowadays. I mean, that's how split
Well
we
said.
are, you know, and she didn't have that. You know, she knew that pain was pain. And that's why one of my talks is actually just called Pain is Pain, or Hurt is Hurt, or something, you know, is because I think that's something that can unify us. And I think she understood that, and was able to embrace the complexities of pain, even when it was on. I think that's why she was could be a peacemaker oftentimes with people. And, you know, and she talks about how she had to make peace with people that she made her nervous, or did when in that book, I Gotta Be Me, and how she'd reach out to them. And she always tried to put herself into that place and understand where that person's insecurity was, or that person's pain was coming from. But at the same time, but still at the same time, keeping her pain was still valid as well. She was still validated. So both parties, both groups are validated.
Yeah.
And that's the problem is we've become so simple-minded. I believe it was, I don't talk a lot about Jung, but Jung said, you know, we judge because thinking is too difficult.
Right.
And so these folks have gotten caught up in judging so much, but my mother was always thinking. And I realized that probably a lot of my compulsive thinking and a lot is there. Like I used to think that she used to just let the pain kind of flow off of her.
Right.
But she didn't. She kept the pain. She had a record. She knew who hurt. She knew who she was hurt by. She knew who she hurt. She knew what was going on. She knew the story, you know. It wasn't this kind of naivete of like, oh, aren't you sweet? You know, it's like she carried it. Like she told some of those stories like with no shellac. You know what I mean? It was like completely like, this is what happened. Like, this is what happened at 700 Club. They erased all of our children's shows tapes out of spite. You know, she was clear about it, but she was like, the show must go on. And so there's that idea of saying like, I'm going to recognize the offense. I'm going to recognize the hurt. I'm going to see it. You know, I'm going to express how I felt, but I'm also going to be able to try to have some empathy from where they felt and move on. So it's almost as like, when you feel too much and when you think too much, or at least you feel that way about yourself, you do get a greater idea of empathy of how to work with people. I've often thought like, God, I always admired people like Jimmy Carter, because he would come in and bring it, help bring peace to like two divided nations,
Sure.
to do that. And now the more I look at someone like my mother, I go, oh, that's what that is she's able to have that mutual understanding and kind of be that middle contradiction for everybody. Like, what is this wild woman with the crazy eyelashes who's really silly and making weird jokes? But we also know we're well loved and she respects us both. So she was able to do that. And honestly, that's something I long to do as well, is kind of be a peacemaker in this culture, to kind of get people to sit down and have the hard conversations and do real politics, and not make compromise a horrible word. Realize that this is the world we live in. So there's going to need to be some compromise in life. There's going to have to be some contradictions that we're all going to have to live with. And I think she really embodied that in so many ways. She was quite graceful to me when I was a teenager. And I think my father would have had the exact opposite of, he was in prison though, wanted to punish me and, make sure and she had a lot of empathy for my pain and my suffering and everything that I was going through. And it's wild to appreciate, your mother even more. I mean, I'm sure this happens after she's gone, but it's like she's still here.
Yeah.
Like she's still speaking. And it's funny because that used to be such a religious thing for me. Like, God is still speaking,
Right.
Still alive, And I'm like, well, so is Tammy,
Yeah.
And I think that's the greatest thing you could wish for in life, is a life well lived, and that a legacy that continues to challenge us to love and include others, and not exclude anybody. But man, it's tough work, Like sometimes I wish I could just put on like the makeup and the the crazy clothes and have more of a defense mechanism, because or more my tattoos are kind of my mother's makeup. She used to joke about that, like, oh, your tattoos are like my makeup, it's your armor, she would say.
Right.
And it is kind of this protection thing, but you just want to say, you want to bring people together. But the thing is, when you start to love other people's enemies, and I honestly, I don't know if my mom, how she would have been able to handle this time. I think would have made her completely heartbroken to see how divided people were. Even in the early 2000s, I remember sitting down with her, and we're starting to see a lot of division between Republicans and Democrats. And I would sit down with her and we would talk about, like, I said, "Come on, can I explain healthcare to you and why that seems like an important thing?" And we would go through that. And as soon as she understood, she had empathy for it. Oh, okay. And then her and Ro would be like, "You went and told your mom about health," We're like, well, yeah, it is. And she was always open to conversations, and she would I felt like the only person she really had undying loyalty to was her children and Jesus for her, and it's so easy to mock her belief system. Like when I was reading the book, I Gotta Be Me, there's so much about me and Jim believe. Me and Jim, we sat down, we prayed together, and we prayed, and it happened, and it's easy to go like, oh, how foolish. But at the same point, we're still sitting here talking about her.
Right.
So I think it's too bad that we've become so jaded that we don't want to allow people like my mom to exist anymore. And
wow.
and that
interesting, yeah, because the belief, though, in terms of your mom's belief, right? It's interesting because in a way we have never lived in a more atheistic time and never lived in a more religious time.
Right.
And many people have said, but Lacan articulates this really well, that God is unconscious. That this compulsion to believe is a very human trait, and that in a more explicit religion, that sometimes that brings it to the surface, and that brings this tendency to the surface, and sort of makes it tamer and more reasonable. And sometimes it's precisely when we have the confidence of thinking that we are, so intellectual and atheistic and sure of ourselves, that we precisely can be led by a sort of religion is comprised of many different dimensions. One of them is sets of sort of rituals, which are potentially nothing really to do with belief as such, and more to do with tradition. And then there are beliefs that are potentially, you know, sometimes more related to reality, and some beliefs that are more, you know, occasionally toxic. And we see this in all kinds of different religion. But this sort of tendency to believe in a toxic way is a very much a universal human trait related to the structure of human subjectivity. And the way that people believe in purity or aspire to purity, and because purity cannot really exist in this sort of messy, earthy world that we exist in, then we create enemies to sustain the illusion of the possibility of purity.
Mm.
And this is a tendency that is not just in, you know, often confessional religions have technologies that mitigate against that. So for instance, in Christianity, it might be love thy neighbor, be a good Samaritan, you know. And in our kind of very confident age, we've done away with a lot of the you know, and not all traditions are good, you know, of course not. I'm not just universally on the side of, you know, restriction and tradition and everything, but sometimes these ideas help, you know, when there is a kind of explicit religious system and there are some beliefs there are often things that mitigate against the excesses of those beliefs. But it's interesting because I think what Jay was delineating in terms of Tammy's approach to Christianity, it was very much an earthy, a here and now, how to make it work in the here and now. And actually, that dialectical approach, which often exists in religious thought and is sometimes absent in a sort of more oppositional, quote unquote, I call it logic, but I don't think it is logic, because I think logic is always dialectical and contradictory, really. But when we do away with this idea of, you know, mystery and contradiction and the unconscious, which logical traditions like psychoanalysis sort of bring back, we actually act in a more religious way, in a way. So it's sometimes precisely a religious system, you know, like Christianity, which for some people involves, you know, a certain vision of heaven after earth, but within the sometimes more confessional approach, there is a tolerance for contradiction in reality, which allows us sometimes to engage with reality in a more practical way, to make something more proximate to heaven on earth, you know. So it's kind of confusing. And I think basically that it's funny that, you know, you had a lot of, maybe let's say, educated people, media figures taking the piss out of Tammy when she was alive, thinking that she was sort of, you know, a southern, maybe working class woman who didn't spend money in the way that they thought was the right way to spend money. And so they came up with sort of notions of her being decadent, when actually in reality, if you look at, you know, you go through her archive of clothes and you see that her jewelry was basically cardboard with rhinestones stuck on it, you know.
True.
Analyze that, you know. So that when, you know, this very easy solution of deciding, well, you know, maybe it's not that Tammy has something to say, is that, you know, Tammy was, you know, a caricature of a certain sort of form of life that a more elite, quote unquote, person would disdain, and therefore to explicate certain things that didn't make sense, it's well, you know, Jim must have been a crook, when it might actually have been that no, he just had a vision and he was trying to fulfill that with great intensity, and maybe his vision was slightly detached from reality. But, you know, that it's interesting that there's always this sort of nefarious intentions read into it. But it's interesting that someone like Tammy, who didn't complete college, you know, who wasn't a great Bible scholar per se, did have a level of wisdom in her approach to Christianity, which some people might use as a reason to discount somebody as being a wise, you know, person with sort of ideas that we need to listen to. But it was actually precisely because of that that she has something to say.
Yeah, no, that makes me think, you know, I've been kind of combing through all of her wonderful quotes, and there was one that at first kind of rubbed me the wrong way, but I think I just misunderstood it. I think it dovetails perfectly into what you were saying, Helen. She wrote, you know, it's so easy to educate ourselves out of faith in God. And at first I thought, oh, that's like an anti-intellectual comment, and I'm really heady and I love reading, but I don't think that's what she was saying. I think we can sometimes so focus on the intellectual components of things that we can completely miss it and not go into the path of wisdom that you were talking about, Helen.
Yeah, it's funny because I felt the same way about that quote, to be honest
Yeah,
with you. And because I love reading and studying and
sure.
scholarship but then I also remember the time my mom was on that Bill Maher's show, Politically Incorrect.
Mm.
And she was on with a very liberal pastor. Gosh, I can't remember his name. I have a couple of his books, and I don't know why his name escapes me right now. But he's a theologian, and then with Bill Maher, of course. And so you have like these two opposite guys, but they're both very liberal and very smart. But one believes in God, one doesn't, or one kind of believes in God, and one definitely doesn't believe. And my mom is here on with them. And what she did was with them in that room is what she exposes is she exposed that they both have a lot of anger behind their intellectualism. Like there's a lot of defense behind the intellectualism of being this, like this is like her, that their intellectualism is her makeup in some ways.
Right.
And so she kind of exposes those folks for what they were. And I will tell you, for me, as much, I've read a little bit of Hegel, not enough just enough to be dangerous, and a lot of Tillich, and a lot of Dr. King, a lot of great books on the Bible and history behind the Bible. I love biblical scholarship, but for me, what it always comes back to is, well, if you're going to buy into this thing, this complicated collection of books and writings over thousands of years, it really does boil down to these kind of few moments that you have to see through. And it's really that love your neighbor as yourself, love your enemy, do good to those, and even Paulinian stuff is actual Paulinian, not reactionary Paul, but, is all also boils down to don't bite and devour one another. Don't hurt one another. It's all this kind of learn how to be as a community, all boils down back to the basic things that my mother grasped. So to me, it's like, I'm always reaching to find the depth of this stuff. And then I read something by Paul Tillich called You Are Accepted and realize, well, that's what my mom, his intellectual understanding of what grace is, my mom understood when she was in her 20s, because she, realized that people are different, So to me, she was, I think Helen agrees with this too, is that she was kind of just had not a special spiritual insight, but she just had a special insight that, most humans don't have. And I don't think most people have, at least not most people who are in front of microphones and on TV right now, that she was just able to have a deeper philosophical understanding of how life worked without, like, as a natural sense. She was just kind of naturally like an untaught thinker.
Yeah, philosopher queen, because it is interesting. Because
that's awesome, philosopher queen.
it's not easy in terms of the logic of the world that we live in is quite oppositional. So we can't blame individuals for being oppositional, because this is the structure of our society is very oppositional. And often the media products that are put forward that take off are ones that satisfy this utopian reactionary aspect of human thought, which is, I know where I'm going, that place is going to be magical and brilliant. Oh shit, this person's in the way. Oh, just happens to be in the way, contingently in the way. Haha, the thing that's preventing me in casting in a shadow the world that I believe exists. So this is, the logic of the market system. So we live in a system of exchange, but it's not really a system of exchange. It's a system of exchange with a glitch in it. And this glitch is this excessive sort of utopian dimension where we believe that a commodity can fulfill us. And we don't just buy a computer because we want to use it to surf the web. We buy Apple, we buy Eden, we buy the fruit, Adam and Eve, we buy desire, we buy all these things sort of enter into it. But it's interesting because I do actually think that a figure like your mum had to come out. It was a different time. The 70s was a different economic time, and it's interesting that Jimmy Carter was around for one season in the 70s, but it's difficult to be a person like your mum in a market system that relies on this sort of utopian reactionary logic on an unconscious level, because it's easier to sell things and it's easier to make people feel anxious and therefore to buy more and to feed into this sort of oppositional logic if the person representing the media product buys into that logic as well. And so it's interesting because your parents obviously were on a religious network. They had their own religious network. And part of the reason why they had to raise money the way they did was because the FCC didn't allow televangelists on mainstream television. So they had to go outside of the normal media system. Yes, okay, everybody requires, it's interesting when people sort of like snob on capitalism and say, oh, I'm an anti-capitalist. Well, we all want to be anti-capitalist.
Right.
Who wants to be exploited, who wants to have to work every day. But we're all part of this system, and it operates also unconsciously. So whether we like it or not, we can do various things to sort of disengage libidinally from the more toxic elements of the market system, but we're all part of it. But your parents, in a way, were in a situation that was slightly different to the normal mainstream. They had to raise money to keep their network on air. So this is where, maybe to certain people for whom the mainstream system worked, this was something that was a bit uncouth, asking for money, and this got them into loads of trouble. But also it meant that maybe they were able to put forward ideas that were slightly different from the kinds of ideas that often take off in the short term in the kind of market system we exist in, which are often these oppositional ideas, these ideas that make us feel more anxious, that make us feel, therefore, try to seek satisfaction more readily and to create enemies. I think in the long term, when we look at great works of art that stand the test of time, I mean, Your Mum in a way is a great work of art that,
yes.
Resists interpretation that stands the test of time. She's doing something that's slightly different to that, because I think, on a deeper level, we yearn for something that's less throwaway, less basic, less oppositional. And I think because Your Mum came up through religious television, it did have, a message potentially in the utopian message, of its own, which maybe is something that we could, discuss or critique in some ways. But this allowed her to say things that maybe wouldn't have been received so readily in mainstream television.
That's well said.
Well, and also the interesting thing is because of how some people saw her as flighty and with the makeup and wild, and she had the Tammy Faye house party where she did the cooking show and stuff, is that if my dad was able to get away with saying things because he wasn't, because he wasn't on, didn't have advertisers to please and things like that. But when he knew something was really hot, Tammy handled it. Yeah. Because my mom could get away with it even more because for some reason she had this license of, well, she's kind of that's just Tammy, so Tammy can talk to the gay guy and love him and hug him and hold him, because that's just, that's Tammy. And so even, she complimented my father's work so much because it opened up to doing things about, talking about sex and penile implants and LGBTQ issues and things like Christians weren't talking about, or people weren't, and she was able to put that on the table and people were just like, oh, Tammy, and it was kind of this kind of wink nudge, like, here's our license to be human. Thank you, Tammy. And we've lost that. And it's sad to me to see the loss of that humanity, that haphazardly humanity that I once had a sponsor of mine in AA tell me I was haphazardly human. And I've always been kind of grateful for that. And I think that's what my mom was in a lot of ways as well. And it's cool to hear, it's cool to hear you guys talking about my mom, and it's great to talk about her because it's just, her presence is so missed. I think about my kids, and my kids even talk about like how they wish she was there. And my daughter's really into like magical thinking right now and fairies and potions. And the other night she was like, I want to make a potion, a secret potion. And I was finally like, okay, well, what do you want the potion to do? And she goes, I want to bring grandma back alive. I was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
I was
so sweet.
For a crickets, cry, because, and it's really sweet because they're starting to see like, oh, grandma was somebody special. She was someone neat, and they both know like she would really love us and really care for us, and she would let us to eat candy, and she liked to eat dessert before dinner, these little things though. And so even just seeing it in that childlike sense, and I raised my kids very similar to, like, I get most of my parenting from my mother because my dad was always working, and it was always just kind of, I could see now where she was in times where she was trying to just survive having me around, and then times where just like, okay, we're going to go on an adventure. And so I don't know. I think there's all sorts of directions we could go in the future, but yeah.
So, okay, no, that's amazing. So I have a theory I want to throw out there, and then kind of a question about Tammy for the two of you, and just kind of bringing us back to the theme of eyes, right? So I think I might have texted you guys this link. In science, there's this theory. Not everyone agrees. There's different interpretations, but I think the consensus is it's called the cooperative eye hypothesis, which basically says if you look at the anatomy of the human eye, that white part, the sclera is very large compared to other primates. And then we have the iris and the pupil. But if you look at like chimpanzees and orangutans and gorillas, the sclera, that white part, is either almost black or it's kind of tinted. It's not as white. And the theory is that it's helped humans, look at each other and figure out where they're looking, right, in relation to their
Right.
environment. So it's basically saying the eyes aren't just an organ of sensation or sight, they're an organ of communication. And I guess the question I have is, when I think of Tammy and I think about eyes, I think of the centrality of actually seeing people and being in relationships.
Mhm.
And I'm just curious, what relationships meant to her, and how that helped her embody who she was. And isn't that something that we're missing these days?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think, well, so sight, it's interesting because I mean, like, it's not the same word, but I is obviously self.
Yes, yes.
One vowel, and then I is the, but eyes, in terms of the way that we interpret eyes, or sight as a sense, it's kind of interesting because I know I think maybe see out of the five senses that sight is that, we see out of the five senses, when when we're
Right.
saying we understand something, that I see is like,
There's like a
wow,
primacy
okay.
to that.
Yeah, there's a primacy to it. So that eyes are so important. But this sometimes means that we think that eyesight, or what we see, is not subjective in any way, or doesn't bear some kind of dynamic of contradiction or difference, that it's absolute. But if you think about, like, when we think of taste, like, taste is a word, so it's one of the five senses, but taste is the word for discernment, for individuality. So for my taste, I like chocolate brownies, but I don't like broccoli. So
Yeah.
that is one of the senses that has a kind of, a subjectivity to it. Whereas, and Lacan talks about this in terms of gaze, that gaze actually, in psychoanalytic sense, is what you see in the other looking back at you. So you see of yourself in the other. So it's sort of this interconnected reciprocity.
Yes.
So sight, we think it's about, and we do live in quite a solipsistic kind of certain age where I think I'm right and I can't be debated and I'm correct and the other person's wrong. But when we think of this idea that even sight, so, taste, we know, is sort of dialectical, that, it's not absolute, and we all have different tastes, that we might, smell things differently, or we might touch things differently, we might have a better or worse sense of hearing. But sight is still, there's such an absolutism to sight. But what psychoanalysis did, and through this idea of gaze with Lacan, is to show that even sight has this sort of, this contradiction in it, that this subjectivity in it, and that maybe Tammy was very good at seeing, the divided nature of the other in their eyes. I don't know, but I think this is,
Yeah.
that what I kind of want to say is that, and I'm very interested in this idea of gaze, that humans are subjective beings, that there's difference in all of us, and what we share is our difference. and that we can be so certain, you know, and that this ideology of sight and the way that we see the world, but actually in our sight, in gaze, we actually see the other looking back at us. We see ourselves in the other looking back at us. Yeah. So there's more of a reciprocity there. And I think it's
so would you say that like our subjectivity gets structured by the others looking at us, the other's gaze?
I think, yeah, that's absolutely true. That's absolutely
I actually wanted to bring up one of the things. So I, you know, as a psychotherapist, I specialize in working with males who have been diagnosed with something called autism. And one of the things they've helped me to see throughout these years is they have felt watched throughout their life, but not seen.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's actually a fundamental distinction. I kind of wanted to throw that out there. Like, do you think that's something Tammy would have resonated with? Not just judging, like you mentioned,
yeah, absolutely,
or just watching others in terms of a surveillance model, but actually seeing them in the context of a relationship.
But I think this is absolutely something that's lacking. You know, with social media, we see each other, but they're on screen and they seem like a whole and complete being, and it's sort of a very, you know, screen culture. You know, the way we relate to screen images is like throughout the history of cinema. You know, it's Grace Kelly on a screen. You know, this isn't just our friend who's our normal friend who we can look at in the whites of their eyes and see them as a friend. And when we see our friend, we know that they have sort of nooks and crannies and they're kind of divided or whatever. But we can't, like, our whole subjectivity is structured through the gaze of the other. And it's only through acknowledging that the other person's divided that we can know that we're seen. So when we know, if we're just seen by, you know, if the being just looks at us without any notion of the thing looking at us is a divided subject who's human, right? Who's broken because they're human, then we can't really experience the experience of being seen. The experience of being seen relies on the other person being a discerning person with, you know, subjectivity and choice and desire, because then we can see what we are like to that person who's actually a person. Yes. So this sounds very complicated, but in this society where, you know, we're only seeing each other through screens as we record this phone call, but it's really important to remember how everybody is a divided subject, and therefore everybody is a speaking subject, incapable of thought, incapable of choices, and has their own desire. And therefore, when we see ourselves through the eyes of somebody who, for instance, they love us and they have a choice to love us, that becomes an even more powerful realization. And yeah, when we are just watched, I think this is a good, you know, difference between being watched by a robot, by a camera that doesn't have subjectivity, but seen by an actual human person. And I think it's really important that to recognize that's dangerous, that's difficult. And part of what Tammy was so amazing with was her ability to open herself to other people, knowing that they have different desires, they have different ways of seeing the world.
Yes.
But it's so important to be seen by somebody who has the capability of being different. Because otherwise we aren't really able to see ourselves and to experience ourselves as a human being who is recognized by another person.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, and it's interesting just to kind of put the physical to this. Is one of the things that was very interesting about my mother is that, like, when people even critique her or say something harsh to her in person or even something nice, she would always reach her hand out towards them and usually take their hand.
Wow.
You know, and if they were really getting intimate, she would get close and definitely hold their hand or hug them, or I'll literally leave a mark. She would literally sometimes kiss them on the cheek, and because her lipstick, you'd have a little lipstick mark on your face. I mean, I don't know how many times I had to rub off the old lipstick. Even when she would send me a birthday card, she'd kiss it and then put a piece of clear tape over it, which is like fantastic because I have some of those, and it's really fun to have that. But she would always hold the hands. And I mean, I don't know how many book signings I would get, and people would be like, "Can I just give you a hug?" And she'd be like, "Of course, honey." You know, I mean, she's 4 foot. She was like 4'11". So, you know, she's a little tiny lady. So it's quite a trip around the old table to go give the people. But she always did that. She always reached out, touched the hands, listened to people, hand on the shoulder. And it's funny because I grew up in a way where I was kind of afraid of, like, touch took energy from me in so many ways. And so I was always amazed by how my mom, and it's interesting now that we're talking about this, is that she didn't just see you, she would also touch you to make you know that we are human. There is a space that we're sharing together, and literally connect with people that way. And it was, it was quite a beautiful thing. I mean, the last time I saw my mom, she and I didn't know it was going to be the last time. She was talking to me and telling me how much she oh, your funny little beard, I had a beard at the time. I still have the beard now, but and she would rub her face against the beard, and she goes, "Oh, it kind of tickles. It kind of tickles," And it was just this kind of like complete, like recognizing everything, and not just recognizing, but experiencing it, and having a giggle and a flirtation and 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 a presence that was there. It wasn't even, you weren't even held at arm length. And I remember reading something by, I think Todd McGowan wrote something about Hegel, and it was something about how Hegel would talk about, and Dr. King talked about this as well too, is like when two people, even in conflict, are in person and experiencing conflict together, arguing in person, there is this kind of forced thing in us that recognizes the other person as a human, like the depth of their humanity in a way that you just don't have with screens. You don't have with these, and they were obviously, these guys weren't talking about screens because they didn't realize we would be here, but they were talking about the shared humanity that even when we come together in conflict, and how even the contradiction or whatever, the conflict, contradiction, all that kind of stuff come together, there's still a shared humanity there. And that was something that my mom saw, but she always went a little bit further with grabbing your hand. I mean, how disarming is that when you're saying something to make fun of somebody, and they come up and they look at you with love in their eyes and say, well, at least meet me first. And then the next thing you know, they're holding your hand. It was completely disarming, but it was her genuine way of just letting people know she loved them. It wasn't like some secret way of like, I'm going to make these people really uncomfortable. It was just her way of being like, oh, honey, oh, baby doll, oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry you've been hurt. I'm sorry that you feel hurt by me, or I'm sorry that you feel that you need to hurt me, but know me first. Know me. Give me a chance, and yeah, there's something about that openness and transparency that just beyond just the eyes, it was, the touch as well.
Yeah. Hey, Jake, can you share that story that you shared before where she met those teenagers at the mall and they wanted to make fun of her?
Yeah, well, and this is the funny thing, is that they recreated this in the movie, and they didn't do a great job at it. And when I met the writer and the director, I said, you guys really should have sat down and let me help you with this script. I said, because the real story is actually better than what you put in the film. So, the film, they're making fun of her, and she signs some autographs and off they go. In the mall, these like skater kids were making fun of my mom. And my mom was alone at the time and living on her own and living in Florida. I mean, not in Florida. She was living in Palm Desert, California. And they're making fun of her. And she does that thing. Oh, kids, hey, now if you're going to make fun of me, at least say hello, and grabs their hands and starts talking to them. And they don't know what's going on. They're trying to give her a hard time. And she goes, you know what? Are you hungry? And she goes, I'll take you up to Marie Callender's, which is like this little pie restaurant, and it was in the mall. She goes, I'll take you guys up. You can order whatever you want, and we'll sit down and we'll learn about each other. Let's just have a conversation. And they said yes. And she went up and took them all to lunch and talked to these teenagers about their life and what they were going through and all this kind of stuff. And and it wasn't like, so she, I think part of it was that she was lonely, but too, it was also that she wanted to understand where these kids were coming from. I mean, I remember when she found out that I'd lost my virginity and all this stuff, and she called my name Jimmy Charles, get in here. I was like going through through my files. What have I done? What have I done? What am I in trouble for? She sits down and she goes, I know that you had sex and blah, blah, blah. And, but I prefer that you not have sex, but if you're going to have sex, I prefer that you use protection and that you be safe. And so she lived in reality too. It was like when I asked her if she would pay for 2 hotel rooms for me and my girlfriend to go see, she bought me tickets to go see Guns N' Roses. I mean, I was 16 at the time. I said, hey mom, would you get us 2 hotel rooms and so we can go to, see Tampa? And it was like 2 hours away. And she's like, I'll get you a room, but I'm not going to buy you 2 rooms because I'm not going to pay for a room to be empty. Like she just knew the reality of it, and she knew like, well, you're going to do this anyway, but I'm going to like try to be real with you and want you to be safe and want you to be careful and want you to be, if you're going to live, even her thing was like, if you're going to live not following what I believe or my principles or things like that, I still want you to be safe and I'm still loving you and I still care for you.
Sure.
And that was really the magical thing about her, is that kind of, I think that live and let live thing is kind of, I grew up being told that was dangerous thinking. But in some ways, I think that's the only way we can live is where we just kind of like, we got to let other people be who they are. And it's not
Don't you
up to
think
me
we're
to
missing? Don't you think we're missing that these days on both sides? The live and let live.
Yeah. Well, and two, I think we all want to live it out. And, like I want to carry my gun in front of you and I want to do this in front, we all want to have to be like, we have to accept 100%,
Mm,
there's no just like any mystery to anything, it used to be that you go to work and you didn't know if the guy was a gun collector or the
right,
woman
right.
was a LGBTQ or anything like, nobody knew and everybody just kind of lived and they were friends. Like, oh, I didn't know you were a Democrat. Oh, I didn't know you were a Republican. But now it's kind of like you come in with guns ablazing,
Mm.
ready to, but with someone like my mom, it just never really none of that seemed to catch her off. So maybe she would have done okay in a time like this. I don't know, but I got to go soon, guys. I got another meeting to be at, but just to let you know.
Okay, how much time do you have?
About 20 minutes.
20 minutes? Okay. Sounds good. Helen, were you going to say something?
No, not really. I mean, I was just going to say about just this identity stuff where as you say, it can be interesting that like maybe the right says that, well, some people on the right might say, oh, that, people on the so-called left, I wouldn't identify a lot of the movement that's called the left, but they're so in your face about what they desire and all this kind of stuff. It's too libidinal, but as you say, the sort of gun carrying is very libidinal as well, and it's very in your face. But almost there's this sort of notion of branding oneself, of categorizing oneself to be easily digestible in the market of ideas for the other. And it's not, and this, I think there's many different reasons why this has happened. But one reason that might relate to Tammy is this idea of being accepted. That basically, in this sort of hyper competitive world where we're all trying to find a space on the sort of greasy totem pole, and also when things get really chaotic and we don't understand what's going on, it's easy for us to sort of create a narrative about ourselves to ourselves as well as to other people, in terms of what we're selling. I'm a this person, I'm a that person, I'm the other person. But in a way, a step before that, step 0 of identity is maybe total acceptance of being, a person who is accepted. So grace as a human being. And maybe that's lacking. And obviously, it's not just it's not just an ideas thing. It's not just we have to sort of accept each other, la-di-da, and it's done. Because I think that like material reality makes people very precarious in terms of, lots of people are living in poverty and all this kind of stuff. But there is this idea of, maybe some of this stuff would become less intense if we had this notion, and it's a very Christian notion of grace,
Yes.
of being accepted for who you are without having to shout it from the rooftops. As you said, like your mum was very honest with, it's all very well being honest with who you are, but sometimes we're encouraged to sort of categorize ourselves. But that's an element of alienation as well, where it's a sort of a pick and mix of identities that are already set, where I say, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this, which maybe is distancing ourselves from ourselves. Maybe we shouldn't have to rely on these category identifiers, and that, sometimes these identification sort of phrases and words rack up, and maybe that's sort of pointing to the fact that like actually we don't know who we are so much, and we wouldn't have to sort of chase our tail with that, and we could actually be more authentic if we did have more of a society that was imbued with a sort of interpersonal recognition and a sense of okayness and a sense of grace. We didn't have to prove ourselves so much to one another.
Yeah. And I think with that, I think of, in terms of psychotherapy, the neuroscientists talk about the neurological foundation of empathy being these mirror neurons. they get, the eyes are central to that. And I've said this before. There's this great psychotherapist, Irvin Yalom, who talks about empathy as seeing through the other's window. I like the idea of seeing through Tammy's glasses, but I think that's so missing nowadays too, just kind of a basic sense of empathy. And I think that kind of actually flows out of what you're talking about in terms of that radical grace and acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I also
Exactly.
think,
Yeah.
yeah. I
Sorry,
mean, I
go on,
also
Jake.
think great pain, like empathy comes from also experiencing a lot of pain
Oh, absolutely.
and recognizing that and the other as well. I often think about like people are like, oh, I'm an empath. Like, and I'll sell this stuff. Like I've always been empathetic, but I've never been like, I'm an empath and I have a special ability to feel those feelings. What I realized is like, no, I'm just obsessive compulsive about certain things. I can watch your eyes and I can see how you move your hands and how you posture your body and relate to a feeling that I've had before and kind of sense this and go, oh, there's the uncomfort there. Being
Right.
dyslexic, in school, you're always watching to like things that are going to make you not feel accepted or make you feel dumb. So you just become aware of your own self and then you become able to
Yes.
see that within others. And I think my mom, growing up the youngest of 11, all the, and then having happened, her dad leaving very early, her mom being rejected from the church early on, strict, Assemblies of God upbringing. I think, the taboos and the forbidden, and then her kind of embracing all of that, and oh, makeup, no makeup. Well, obviously she, rebelled against that, and women aren't supposed to wear pants, you know what I mean? That kind of thing, like, and don't go to movies. I mean, she said the first time her parents went to see the Ten Commandments, the movie, she thought they were for surely going to hell. It didn't matter that it was Christian, God
Yeah.
oriented. They're going to hell. She told them, mom and dad, that if they went, she was going to pack all of her stuff and leave, And I think they called her bluff. And then my dad took her to her first movie, White Christmas. And she thought, oh, hope Jesus doesn't come back while I'm at the theater, but she kind of learned to embrace all that stuff. But she understood the pain. She understood what it was like to feel the, forbidden, to worry that, God's this evil eye or watching over you or keeping records. I mean, so she was able to kind of read people well, and I think that was part of her gift. I don't think she knew. I don't think she, I mean, she probably knew the word empathy, but she probably didn't really know what it meant. But she was loaded with it, to the point where she could almost do it through a screen. She could really just, with just a one-sided with a camera, she knew people were hurting. And I think that's what people related to, is that a lot of people made fun of her tears and her crying and SNL and things like that. But I think there was a lot of group of people who were up late at night crying and alone and feeling like my life, overwhelmed by their life, whether it's overwhelmed by their marriage or their family or their bills or whatever. And they're like, what am I going to do? I think a lot of us feel that way. And I just don't think people are used to seeing those emotions in real, like they were,
Sure.
people act that way, but they weren't used to seeing people just emotionally on TV. And I think that's why a lot of people connected with her. And I think that's why we find out a lot of people like Elton John connected with her. I was reading a book about John Lennon, and he would watch later, all these different people would watch because there was something just saying, you know what, it's okay to cry. It's okay to worry. And it's okay to want something better. And it's always really ironic and strange to me that these are the people like that the newspaper, the Charlotte Observer decided like, we've got to destroy these people, and that these are going to be the people that we go after. And this is going to be, these are the people who are just like, hey, come get some time away and come to Heritage USA, and have a nice week with your family and feel these emotions. And we want you to live a better life, so there was, but it wasn't, it wasn't utopia without the promise of, there was still the tears, there were still the emotions, there was still the recognition of marriages fall apart, people get sick, these realities were still there. So it wasn't like this, we're gonna, if you give $1,000, there's not going to be any more suffering in life. It was like, we're going to learn how to live life on life's terms, but we're going to hope for something different. And I think there was a power to that on both of my parents, honestly.
Yeah,
I
it's
think
powerful.
though it's quite logically explicable why your parents were the victims of this sort of excessive cancellation, because you can talk about, the certain, you know, mismanagement in some ways, although if you look at the books of any big organization, I'm sure there's certain, you know, oversight and mismanagement, mistakes and things like that. And, you know, you and I know so many of the statistics on this,
Yeah.
which we maybe won't bore people with, but but you know, the 45-year sentence sort of says it all. But I mean, it's explicable on the one hand why your parents became scapegoats from the media class of religion as a whole, even though it's almost just because they weren't part of the moral majority, but because of the economic and political milieu of that moment, there was a sort of culture war going on. I mean, do we have time to get into this now? Or
yeah, you know, yeah. I realized I was off by an hour anyway, so yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I didn't have too long either, but basically it's interesting. I mean, this is not necessarily the correct take. This is, I've been working on this stuff with Jay for several years and being familiar with the historical sort of landscape, and from my perspective, right, which might be wrong, but this is my perspective, what was going on. So in the 70s, you have there is a big Jesus movement, and this is for various different reasons, but one reason is that the 20th century is quite a scary place for a lot of people. We're moving towards a greater embrace of capitalism, sort of breaking down of traditional family structures, greater freedoms, and with greater freedoms comes sort of greater fears about the power that freedom gives you. And so sometimes this causes retreats into sort of more religious thinking. So just as things become freer, things become more religious. And we see this in different places all around the world. But the interesting thing is that the Jesus movement of the 70s was quite left-wing, quite liberal. So, you know, you had sort of lots of hippie Christians in California and things like that. And you have Jimmy Carter, who is an evangelical, who gets elected and is possibly the most left-wing president, you know.
He gets interviewed on Playboy.
At least, well, exactly. One of them, you know, fiscally, especially in the history of the Democratic Party. And he's an evangelical. And I don't think it's, you know, he was left-wing despite being evangelical. I think his Christian values were precisely what, you know, informed his political. Yeah. But then what happened is you have, because, you know, there is a big, especially at that time, there is a big Christian bloc in America. As I say, that the Jesus movement is quite, you know, there's elements of it that are quite hippie and quite left-wing, but there's also, you know, an aspect of more traditional Christianity that's quite more conservative. And as Jimmy Carter gets voted in, he's an evangelical. It's sort of almost, you know, the narcissism of small differences. He's a religious person like us, but he really doesn't represent this form of Christianity. So you have a big swing to the right within some parts of American Christianity. And this is by no means all, but in some parts. And you had the formation of the moral majority, which is a more conservative aspect of Christian culture in America. And with the support of the moral majority, Reagan is elected. Jay's parents didn't vote for Reagan and didn't join the moral majority, although your dad did interview Reagan as part of PTL. Yeah. But then what happens is you have you know, a more educated, liberal media class that very much doesn't like Reaganism. And again, this is not universal at all, but there are trends here. And simultaneous to this, in the 80s, there is this wider prosperity culture, which, you know, I would say your parents weren't first and foremost prosperity preachers, but it was more a symptom of the age. You had people becoming more prosperous who had been more working class. Pentecostals tended, you know, Jim and Tammy were Pentecostals, tended to come from more working class backgrounds. It actually had a very working class, very diverse roots, Pentecostalism. And, you know, these were just people who were, you know, I think your parents' ministry was more of a symptom of the growing wealth of, you know, working people and middle class people in America. So I don't think, you know, that prosperity was their key thing. But also, you know, for a media class who was potentially nervous about the moral majority and about Reagan. What starts to happen when you feel under threat, as anybody does this is a human tendency, is to universalize and to oppositionalize. So is to see Christianity as synonymous with the right and is synonymous with conservatism.
Right.
Even though, as we said, Jimmy Carter was possibly, so socialistic because he was a Christian. It was his Christian values that made him think about, the benefit of what, wider society rather than individualism. And your parents, yes, whilst there was an element of the prosperity gospel and what they were doing, this was maybe more to do with celebrating changing living standards in Middle America, positive thinking, and also, that they did come from a more working class background, and potentially they spent money in a way that was uncouth for more middle class, Ivy League educated, not to generalize,
Well, they both grew up very working class. Yes.
Yeah. And I think there is a sort of the excesses maybe were distasteful in some ways. But anyway, I think that's a sort of separate issue. But I think that, and as I say, this is just my opinion. And I think there's an element of this, in what went on, is that your parents, on the one hand, were a threat to the moral majority because they weren't playing ball in terms of that side of the culture war. And on the other side, there was this sort of liberal media impetus to universalize and to say, and we think of this today, people say Christians and the right seem to have this sort of synonymous relationship in our minds, but that's just absolutely not the case. And so your parents, it was difficult to differentiate between the moral majority, some of the more career prosperity preachers, and your parents came to represent something that they didn't actually represent. But I also think something else was going on, and I think almost the opposite also was playing out. There were multiple dynamics, and I think the unfortunate thing was your parents happened to get contingently caught up in all of these different dynamics. So they weren't playing ball in terms of the culture war with some of the other major televangelists who were part of the moral majority, and they were showing them up as well in terms of their their naive belief potentially. And then from another perspective, they represented the moral majority even though they weren't part of the moral majority. But also there was this sort of notion, I mean, sometimes the person who embraces the enemy is more damaging to a movement, let's say a reactionary movement, than the enemy itself. But that's a whole other issue. And again, maybe another element of, these sort of chaotic elements that were all at play that your parents happen to get caught up in. But something interesting happened under Donald Trump's presidency. And I thought this was a really interesting example. So for Trump, there was this idea, and there's an element of truth potentially, just as there's an element of truth to lots of things, that the media class in Hollywood was sort of snobbish towards Southern state people, red state people, and they didn't really represent, people, the kinds of people who maybe voted for Trump. But again, that's quite oppositional logic. And, whilst that maybe is true to some extent, you can always find examples where that's not true. And I think one example of this was this film called The Hunt, which was a comedy. And the comedy was about sort of liberal elites, quote unquote, hunting deplorables for sport. And we talked about jokes in the earlier aspect of the episode. So this film was a comedy, right? If you just say this is a film which shows liberal elites hunting deplorables for sport, you're like, well, this is terrible. This is really offensive. This is really harmful to communities who aren't these liberal elites, and this is really offensive. But this is not understanding that this was an ironic and a jokey gesture, which was sending up the liberal elites, and actually was on the side of, the culture that that Hillary Clinton called the basket of deplorables. It was actually a pro-red state film, and it was funny, and it was showing, the excesses and the sort of, it was poking fun at the liberal elite, let's just say. But Trump really made a big thing out of this film and almost got it completely sidelined from wider culture. So it was really not seen at all. Yeah. But the reason that he used, the explicit reason was, this is offensive to red state people. But actually, the trouble was, it was a Hollywood film that showed that not everybody in Hollywood was part of this so-called, you know, coastal liberal elite who hated deplorables. It was a very
Right.
quote unquote deplorable, empathetic film. And it
Mm.
was more threatening potentially to have a film like that, which punctured a hole in this wider narrative where, you know, there was an element of truth in that narrative, but that kind of like totalitarian narrative. Actually, this film really sent it up, and it was a very clever, funny film mocking precisely the sort of liberal elite Hollywood culture. And it was very empathetic to, you know, people who maybe living in different areas of the USA. So it can be more threatening to have something that doesn't fit the narrative, and that needs to be eliminated. So, you know, from all sides, all directions, potentially, your parents didn't fit. And for somebody who is looking at all evangelicals being right-wing, reactionary, or whatever, that was a threat. You've got to get rid of, you know, but then you can come up with more explicit reasons. But I think the thing that was just sort of insane, and we talked about this a lot in different settings, is that the Titanic, right, was a boat that sank, and boats sink all the time. But for some reason, it captured the public's imagination. And it did so because it embodied all kinds of contradictions, the sort of swarm of issues that were happening in society at the time. So you had the change from a more kind of like pastoral society into a mechanized future with this big ship, you know, so it's sort of the excesses of capitalism and industry. You had the different classes. This was like the turning point between, you know, the aristocratic, really stratified class system in the West to something, you know, more messy. It was right on the verge of World War One, you know, where the world changed forever. It was, you know, there were so many different things going on there, which made it interesting. And I think part of what makes what happened to your parents, Jay, so interesting is that there are so many different things going on that your parents' case contingently captured. And the thing was that from many different perspectives, whichever way you cut the cake on it, the take is wrong, because it doesn't take into consideration the fact that it was so many things were going on there. And I think it was precisely your parents' innocence that made them, and not, you know, innocence, I'm saying in a kind of naivety sense, not in a kind of like they did nothing wrong sense, that made them particularly vulnerable to quote unquote cancellation. And sorry, that was a long one, but you know,
No, I mean, but you're right. I mean,
for a long time. Yeah.
If you think about it, you know, I mean, the two main people who came after them, you've got Jerry Falwell, who's started the you know, the Christian right, the conservative, what was it, the moral
majority, yeah.
And my dad said, you know, we're not going to join. We don't feel like that's what we're called to do. And then you've got this reporter, what's his name? What was the reporter? Charlotte Zerber's reporter's name? Helen?
Charles Shepard. I mean,
yeah, then you have Charles Shepard, who's kind of this reporter for the Charlotte Observer, who's kind of like the Southern liberal elitist, you know, and, you know, went to really, you know,
Harvard,
went to Harvard, did all these. And so the two people who seem to come after my parents really are the biggest critique of my parents are these two extremes that would never be, would both probably say the other was more sided with my parents. But, you know, they both, you know, come after my parents in a way of disapproval. So, you know, they're not Christian right enough. They're not getting involved with politics. They're not doing this. And the left is going, oh, they believe in a man in the sky, and look at how they spend their money. And I heard that they got, you know, cinnamon buns to make a room smell good. And, oh my God, can you believe this? And the decadence, and in the name of Jesus, you know, and you should be poor and living on the street. You know, you have these two people who come together and are just pounding my parents just every day and making these things up. So it is strange how you have these two extremes of either side who come together and go, you know, the Charlotte Observer newspaper as well is behind it, because they're, you know, so you've got the liberal, kind of what would be seen as the, you know, the liberal media, and then you've got the conservative evangelicals, and they both come in and do this. And my parents kind of get caught in this crosshair. And what's wild though is they get caught in the crosshair, and then everybody decides that it's okay for them to be the scapegoats, you know, and and that was the thing, is like, I think what Helen's saying is there was a lot of classism, but on both sides,
Yeah, I
and
mean, some of the people from the moral majority also Yale graduates and stuff. I mean, yeah, and I'm not saying
yeah,
it's interesting because I think in a way, when I say like, oh, we're going to name names, it's like in a way it doesn't really matter who did,
right,
who was enacting, because these are sort of wider forces. And as I say, like, people act in a way that they think is the right thing to do. But I think that once something like this has happened, it is worth thinking about. And as I say, like, even if this take that I'm sort of putting forward isn't capturing reality in its totality, I think precisely what we're talking about in terms of intersubjectivity and being a divided subject, it's important that we are able to have these conversations from different perspectives and take these things into account to really look at what we're dealing with in terms of wider society. But yeah, no, it is interesting, and I do think that we talk about cancellation in a very sort of facile way today, and in a way like everybody's cancelled, everyone's been cancelled.
yeah,
But your parents really went through something that was an astonishing level. And you mentioned the cinnamon buns. I think it's interesting as well, because the level of decadence that we're talking about, quote unquote, is like, so I mean, Jay's parents' salaries, first of all, what they made in royalties from books and record sales that they then put back into the ministry was nothing compared to the salaries. So it was much more than the salaries that they actually took out.
Almost 2 times more than their salaries.
2 times more. And it's not even, we're talking about single digit millions over several years. It's not a huge amount of money compared to, we're talking about CEOs today, and you have like people making 100 billion during the pandemic. I mean, it's just insane, and these sort of things like cinnamon rolls. Well, there was an incident where in a hotel room, Don Hardestow, who's the head of security for PTL, bought $100 of cinnamon rolls and put them in the oven of the sort of suite to heat up to create a scent. I mean, and this was seen as the height of, but it's $100. I mean, come on, we have people flying private jets left, right, and center, and as I say, making hundreds of billions off the backs of sort of exploited people working for Amazon and stuff. Or another one was the Rolls Royce that gets talked about, that your dad had this Rolls Royce, but your dad actually had a hobby of restoring cars, including this Rolls Royce, and he only drove in it you only drove in it one time, and once
and it was kind of a wreck.
Once he refurbished it, he donated it to charity. So it was all these things where anything can be interpreted. Like, this is the curse of being human, right? Like, it's important that we recognize there is this subjectivity and that we can interpret things, but the interpretation can always go a way that we don't want it to go. So that's really dangerous. But
and the funny thing is it's one of those situations too. I think about the Rolls Royce and this time there was that damned if you do, damned if you don't. Like, he was fixing this up in the desert, and he did a show with and he showed the Rolls Royce that he was working on. So people are like, oh, look at the decadence. But at the same time, had he not shown it, people would have been like, did you know he had a Rolls Royce that he kept secret? You know what I mean? But none of them mentioned, like, do you know that he, donated it to the Shriners Hospital, Children's Hospital? Did you know? I mean, it's like, it's also very selective viewing and thinking, and a lot of like, well, what we think is right and what we think is wrong. And
so guys, can I ask y'all this question? And I'm hoping that we kind of come back to this in future episodes. I think, at least for me and probably a lot of people, there's a temptation to want to like idealize. Okay, let's take Saint Tammy and idealize her, and maybe even today, right? Helen, you were talking about this when I interviewed you for the other podcast. It's easy to sort of create these 5 steps for how to become this like better person or this more authentic person. Is that really what we're supposed to do, is to idealize her, or is she kind of a window into our own subjectivity and maybe the nature of grace and reality? How do you get, maybe that's a false dichotomy. I don't know. What do you guys think? What should be the approach when we think about someone like her? Is she an ideal?
I think she would be the first to tell you that she was not a saint. Like, I think if she saw that saint of her,
sure,
she would be like, honey, I'm no saint, she knew she was human.
But everything in this sort of universe falls into its opposite at a certain point, and it was precisely because she didn't aspire to sainthood that makes her sort of, in a way, saintly. And I think if she's a saint of anything, the patron saint of anything, it's the grit and grime of the world.
Yes.
You know, she didn't live a lofty existence. She was very libidinal. You know, and I always think of this sort of phrase that she said, that God didn't make any junk. But in a sense, maybe we're all junk. We are all junk.
Yeah. Well,
Wait,
then
are you saying that I'm junk?
We're all made of the same old dirt.
Junk, that's for sure.
You think of God doesn't make any junk, and then she'd be, but honey, we're all made out of the same old dirt.
That's
So
Yes.
in some ways, you know, we're not junk, but we're dirt.
yeah.
You know? So
Okay, we're
it's
not
kind of
junk.
that contradiction of that she held. So that was, you know, that's, you know, my mom was very human, you know, and I think, and we can talk about that in maybe another episode, but she was, you know, I mean, she had doubts, you know, she wasn't, you know, I mean, she was one of the most faithful people I knew in a really strong way, not in a naive way. But there were times where, when she got sick again, she really doubted God and doubted where God was, and was angry and hurt and felt abandoned.
Yeah.
You know, which you could go like, you know, she had her crucifixion moment, you know, the moment where she realized that she was going to die, you know. So I think that's what attracts people to her, though, is like, once again, is that humanity. She obviously doesn't have her shit together, because people who have their shit together don't wear that kind of makeup, and don't dress like that, don't, you know, don't act that way, and don't sing songs like that, and aren't, you know, don't like to be made fun of, you know. You know, so she was definitely knew that, you know, she knew what people thought of her, but she still just, I think there's, you know, where I can saint my mother is that whole I've got to be me thing, you know. And funny is because I've seen pastors actually talk about my mom's book, I Got to Be Me, as being like how ungodly that is, and you've got to die to yourself. And I've even seen progressives do it. It's really funny that my parents always get hate from both sides. It's like,
sure.
And love from both sides. So it's like, I never feel like I'm like, hey, can everybody just stop feeling about my folks so I can have some feelings? But that whole "gotta be me" thing is true. But her saying I gotta be me is like, I gotta be me so I can love other people more, and so I can learn to love myself more. And I think for me, that keeps me going every day. It's like, I was gonna, you know, just a few weeks ago, I had to make the decision if I was going to close down Revolution, which I've been doing for almost 30 years.
Wow.
And my mom's book, I finished I Gotta Be Me finally. And I was like, I got to continue on, because this is my work. This is my passion. You know, whether I believe in God or don't believe in God or all these things, this message of grace is important. And this is such a big part of who I am. And played into that decision, you know. So for me, also this concept is like, I'm around a lot of people who are atheists and intellectuals and things like that, and think faith is kind of a funny concept. And there's times where I don't have much faith, but I always have a mustard seed of faith in my wallet that my mom gave to me. You know, I always have it. And so I've realized, like, there's something grateful about that, because it's almost like the trump card for me. You know, it's almost that, like, when everything gets over intellectualized, overthinking, you know, I love to think, figure out things, but sometimes I just have to just reach back into the pocket and have that little faith of my mom. Is like, well, at least at least the bill collectors can't eat you. You know, they can't kill you. You know, they make you wish you were dead, but at least you're still got this life to live. And so there's some sort of saintliness behind that says, you know, there's something true to that little ounce of that little tiny bit of faith that I had that got me through. And you can carry that with you. And, you know, if you know anything about the Bible, there's a Bible verse about all you have to do is have the faith the size of a mustard seed. So for me, she gave that to me, and I'm grateful for that, you know, because, you know, I can explain why there's no God, and I can explain why I believe there could be a God, and why that God is nothing like most people think, and that it's not about confessional Christianity, and it's not about a man in the sky, and it's more about ground of being and things like that. But, you know, sometimes it's just better to sleep at night knowing that you know, that mustard seed that she gave me, I mean, not in a literal sense, but just in my heart, you know, that mustard seed she gave me that I have in my back pocket I'll sleep and I'll live to fight another day and think it out another day. So in some ways, that's a very saintly characteristic, because
Mm,
I mean, when I think of reasons I continue, I think of like, it's funny that I'm putting my mom, like I think of Dr. King, you know, and his love for people and his ability to deal with his enemies. But I also
mm,
think of my mom's love for people and her ability to deal with people who made her, who tried to make her the butt of jokes, and that she would sit down and know that these people were making fun of her and then disarm them. You know, that to me is really beautiful. And I
yeah.
wish we had more of that. You know, I see all these speakers and all these thinkers, and you know, and they just what there's a big Canadian speaker, I can't remember his name.
Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, Jordan Peters. You know, someone asked to debate him, and he goes, "Why would I debate you? You have no audience." You know,
I saw
this
that.
smugness and just
Yeah.
this, just like, ugh, that's gross. You know what I mean? It's like I'm above speaking to such petty little people. You know, and I'm like, to me, it's like, what happened? You know, why? I think, you know, there is a kind of a longing for a simple. You know, we say we long for simpler times, but maybe there's a longing for a simpler person
Mm,
who 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 didn't draw lines in the sand. And I feel like that's what my mom was a part of. She just was never too good. She never thought she was above anybody. And that was really kind of a beautiful thing. I mean, there were things that my parents did when there were no cameras around, and there were no, you know, and my mom and dad both did. And I realized, oh, they really believe this stuff. Like, oh, like they really believe it in a very hard, difficult way of like loving people who are very hard and difficult, or loving the poor, or loving people who, like, I remember my dad, there was this guy, and would walk to his church every day after they'd lost everything. My parents were doing a church, I mean, in a skating rink, like they'd lost they're, you know, in a skating rink trying to do church again. And there was this guy, and he always pissed his pants, was and then there he was on the side of the road, pissed his pants, and my dad pulls over, picks him up, brings him into
wow.
the car, and I'm like, what is he doing? And he's like, you know, we got to get this guy a ride to church. And I'm like a
Mm,
kid, you know, I'm like 11, 12 years old, kind of like freaked out. And but at the same time, it was just like, these are people.
mm.
These are people, and they're worthy to be, they're worth loving. We've got to love these people. And you know, and not seeing my mom go, Jim, don't you dare pull over. Like, you know, no, she said, yeah, honey, let's, you know, it's like, and they would do things like this. Like, I could say countless amount of times, but I'm not going to try to prove who they are, if they're righteous or they're great. Or, you know, they're
Sure.
also, and I don't talk to my dad anymore, and we don't get along at all. And I'm really hurt by him. And, you know, I wish my mom would have done things differently when, you know, planned more before she passed away. I mean, there's all these issues. So let's not
Sure.
just romanticize it. But there were also things where I was like, wow, these folks really, you know, go to places that are uncomfortable and love people who are really unlovable,
Mm,
and even would love their enemies. And she forgave, like when Jerry Falwell died, I remember she cried,
wow.
you know. And so to me, it was like, I mean, I remember we were literally at Applebee's. She loved Applebee's, and we're at Applebee's. You know, that's kind of contradiction my mom is. And that Applebee's is the butt of everybody's joke now, you know. And my mom loved Applebee's. And she goes, let's go to that hometown place. I'm like, Mom, that's just their advertisement. They're a chain. In the neighborhood place. And here Falwell dies. And my sister says, like, ding dong, and the witch is dead. I'm going like, thank God this guy's not going to hurt any more people. And my
Mm,
mom's crying because she's like, he was a human being. He was a part of her life. He was part of the story.
wow.
And she saw something deeper in it than even, you know, me and my sister could see. And my dad was the same way. And I always, you know, and I guess what I'm trying to, this is such a long answer. Me and Helen are giving long answers today to your question, but the saintness of my mother, the saintliness of my mother was as this willing to constantly forgive people and try
Mm,
to work out differences. And then when they couldn't work out differences, still accepting them. You know, like not accepting what they've done necessarily, but still seeing their humanity, even when there was no peace made. You know, there was, you know, you didn't get to make your peace. You know, you didn't get to get
and
closure.
we need more of that in the world.
Yeah. So,
Mhm.
but it's really hard. it's really, really difficult. Like I try to
Yes.
do that on my own work. And this is why I didn't say like, well, we can't call it Saint Tammy. She wouldn't like that. You know, and why I didn't is because I was like, who cares if she doesn't like it? It's true, because this work is so damn hard to do. It is so
Yes.
hard to love people on both sides when I don't know if the end of my career is going to come from a conservative or from a liberal, because
Mm,
I'm not sure which one's the meanest one, you
I
know. And now that I,
know.
that's a
and I
good
feel like I
point.
live outside of like, I feel like I live outside of the world. Like
Sure.
I'm the world, my country. I'm like, my country is completely divided, and I don't want to side. That's why I really like punk rock in Belfast, is because when the punk rock movement came into Belfast, you know, there were, you know, there were, uh, uh, sorry, I'm getting off. We've been talking forever. There were, what's the word I'm looking for? Help me here, Helen. The two sides. There were the,
Reconciliation, there was exploding of the kind of paradigm, there was
yeah. Well, I mean, it was binary thinking.
yeah.
You know, it was like, you know, are you Catholic or are you Protestant? You
Right.
know, and punk rock came along, and these bands were Catholic and Protestant members. They didn't give a shit. They didn't want that way. They didn't want the binary way. They wanted to think
Right.
differently. They wanted to be together, and they wanted to say, we're not going to do this. And so, you know, I have admire that kind of attitude, is because I'm trying to live in that life. I saw my mom do that in such a loving way. And it's really hard to do without wanting to poke a little bit. You know, it's really hard, you know, because you do have to kind of expose it. And sometimes exposing those things is hurtful.
Yes.
But ultimately is to heal. And
Mm.
I think my mom was just able to do that in a way that was so beautiful, that it was just, you know, like, you know, I just love everybody.
No, well
And
said.
genuinely mean it. That's what she was able. I just love everybody, and she really meant it.
Yeah.
And so you know, I'm trying to follow in footsteps like that. You know.
Mm, that's awesome. Okay, guys, I'm so sorry. I do have to cut it off because I have a client
Yep.
that I'm going to see in 1 second. It was really great to connect with you guys. I hope we can do it again soon.